This is For Advisors by Advisors. I'm your host, Evan J. Mayer, and today we have a very special guest, and Mr. Lance Cibik. What's going on, Lance?
What's up? I like the round of applause. I don't get that very often.
I said it. I think I did.
It was 90%. We'll give it to you.
Okay, cool. I'll take it. So Lance has been in our business for 23 years, mostly on the wholesaler side and then in the last almost 10 plus years was working for SunTrust and BB&T that eventually ended up merging into Truist and left them basically at the start of the year to start his new exciting position we're going to be talking about momentarily. But welcome to the show, Lance.
Thanks, Evan. Thanks for having me.
For sure. Give us a little bit about your history in the business. Obviously, you were with SunTrust from April of 2011 through 2013, so good 12, 13-year run there. But give us a little about your history in the business. How did you get started, and then your journey to get you to where you are today?
Yeah, I'll keep it high level. Won't get into the details.
Sure.
But back as a senior in college, I did an internship with a local financial advisor at Smith Barney, which has gone on to become Morgan Stanley. And so that got me some exposure to the business, being a personal finance guru, as well as being a finance major. And so out of college, I got an opportunity to be a rookie trainee broker, financial advisor with Morgan Stanley. And so I got my licenses, got some exposure to the business at 22 years old. But I realized pretty quickly that the idea of a 22-year-old getting in front of people in their 50s, 60s, and beyond to try to convince them that I was the best advisor that they should consider hiring was just something I didn't believe in. And so I had an opportunity to pivot and move into the mutual fund wholesaling business. And so I started off as an internal mutual fund wholesaler with, at the time, was a firm called Nations Funds. It went on to become Columbia Threadneedle Investments, which is what it is today. So a combination of being an internal mutual fund wholesaler as well as an external wholesaler out in Seattle, covering the Northwest, the major broker-dealer wirehouse firms, which ultimately then got me from Seattle back to Charlotte, where I live now, working with firms like Wells Fargo Advisors and most recently Truist Wealth, in a position where I was helping advisors raise assets and retain assets on the fee-based advisory platform.
Excellent. And that's where my story with Lance goes as far as how I met Lance. I joined SunTrust with a very little amount of assets and was working with his co-partner, Christine Utter, who covered Florida and I don't know about probably other states too. And Lance did that for, I believe, the North, right? You were more the North area?
Yeah, Carolinas, Georgia, all the way up the coast of Virginia, Maryland, D.C. So I basically had every state except Florida, which is what Christine had at some point in my career there.
Excellent. And very, very helpful in learning the managed systems that they have in place there, what you could do, what you couldn't do. You started there very early on and watched that evolution of a program go from very low fee-based production in that 10-year period. You guys probably grew the fee-based production significantly. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was a great opportunity because when I got there 13 years ago, it was still a heavily based transactional firm, especially in the traditional bank branch environment where you had a lot of A shares, C shares, annuity business, structured product business. And so many of the financial advisors that I would meet with had very little to no advisory accounts. In fact, they were just so intimidated by the advisory account space as almost as if it was a foreign language. And so presented us as a team a great opportunity to come in and say, hey, Evan, it's not as tough as you might think. In many ways, it's just repackaging investments in a different approach and then starting to compare and contrast some of the advantages for the client and also for the advisor. Presented a lot of opportunity to convert accounts, but also help that advisor go out and compete, as I used to say, with the big boys and girls at firms like Merrill Lynch and UBS and Morgan Stanley.
It's almost packaging like a different mutual fund for a guy or gal that did a lot of A shares or C shares in the Columbia Threadneedle mutual funds. All of a sudden, hey, we can put you in a bunch of different things. And the great news is that you're not paying us commissions to do it. we win when you win and we lose when you lose concept. Yeah.
Yeah, the classic scenario was we'd sit down with an advisor and then have an account with a hodgepodge of mutual funds, right? It could even be a mixture of A share and C share mutual funds from different fund families that they sold once upon a time, or maybe they inherited, and nobody's reviewing and monitoring. The funds are not getting rebalanced, and the advisor didn't even know if the asset allocation even matched up with the client's investment objective or the risk tolerance. And so when you started to do side-by-side comparisons with opportunities to decrease expense ratios, better align the client's risk tolerance, pick better funds that had a higher likelihood of outperformance or at least lining up with what the client was looking for. And then, oh, by the way, maybe decreasing the all-in cost or at least it being a wash just really put the advisor in a great position.
And what would be some advice you would give to advisors that are out there that are maybe still not positioned into doing managed accounts? What's a good way to get that book moved over properly? What's an easy scenario or two that you would give to the advisor to give to their clients?
I gave you one, right? The hodgepodge of mutual funds where there's no rhyme or reason for what the client owns. You may have a bunch of overlap in the underlying securities. A classic example would be, hey, I own 5 American Capital Group funds. And when you look at the 5 funds, it's basically the same fund. And so the client's not as diversified as they might think they are. And so that's a diversification story that allows you to go to an advisory approach. But you'd also see a hodgepodge of stocks or a hodgepodge of bonds with no real rhyme or reason why the client owned stocks or bonds. And it presented a great opportunity to bring in a professional stock manager or professional bond manager to say, hey, listen, I can improve your credit quality. I can increase your yield. And oh, by the way, I can manage some of these losses, some of the credit issues, lower your expenses, and on a go-forward basis, really stay on top of this portfolio. And so I think there are still just plenty of opportunities out there with advisors, whether they have accounts currently today or through the competitors across the street.
So talk a little bit about the merger, okay? I always like to talk about these scenarios because you know how it can affect advisors. You rarely hear how it impacts the support staff around those advisors and working with a different team. When that merger happened, you were obviously part of that merger and then left pretty much, I mean, the merger is now complete. Talk us over those last 4 years and how things changed from the SunTrust AMS, like we're here to help and we're really helping to push the advisors upstream to where things might have changed or detoured.
Yeah, I've yet to meet anybody that says mergers are fun. Okay, I don't care what firm, what industry. And so the reality is you're taking 2 really big organizations with different people, different cultures, even though they could be similar, different systems, different products, different ways of looking at things, and you're trying to bring them together and you're trying to do it quickly. And so naturally by doing that, you're going to have some friction. And many of the, let's call it BB&T, Scott and Stringfellow advisors had to come to the SunTrust platform, the custodian, and many of the technology services. And so that put them in a tough spot, right? Because it felt in a lot of ways like they were changing firms, right? I mean, like as if they decided to go to Merrill Lynch when they didn't decide to go to Merrill Lynch. And so they're having to learn new systems, new ways of doing things, new products. And look, that puts home office people in a tough position because they're there to help the advisors, but they also recognize that they may not be the advisor's best friend that day, you know? So it's a tough period of time for sure.
Tough transition. So the way I found out about you leaving was in December, you started posting things that I pretty much knew you wouldn't be able to get through compliance anywhere else. And it was really touching, and you really opened yourself up, in my opinion, at least to the world, on things that transpired in your past and how you use that as motivation to go forward. Talk a little bit about what transpired in December and then this push forward and then what you're doing now to fuel development in professionals.
Yeah, great question, Evan. After 22 years in the business, in the industry, rising the ranks to become a senior vice president, divisional sales director. I loved what I was doing, but I also felt, Evan, like I was being called to do something in addition to what I was doing, or to maybe even take a complete different path. And part of where that feeling was coming from is, to your point, I wanted the ability to share what was on my heart with other people outside of the four walls of the company. And so that led to me hiring a business coach who said, "Hey, Lance, think about everything that you've gone through in your personal life, everything that you've gone through in your professional life, those difficulties, those trials, those tribulations, the pain, the suffering, what you've overcome, what you've gotten through, the steps that you took, the process that you implemented to get you to where you're at today." And he said, "Hey, listen, here's a line that I want you to think about. And this applies to you, Evan, applies to all the listeners. You, me, all of us are expertly positioned to help our past self. We are expertly positioned to help our past self. That could be the 5 years ago version of you, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And to consider the people out there that are going through something that you were going through, that so desperately need you to come alongside of them. Give them encouragement, give them motivation, give them coaching, be their advocate." And so that led me down a path, Evan, which is where I'm at today, to number one, be a motivational speaker, right? Go into youth organizations, sales organizations, corporate organizations, and provide a motivational message. And then number two, put myself out there as a performance coach to expertly position my past self. And that can mean a lot of different things depending on where you're at. It could be something you're struggling with in your personal life. It could be something that you're hitting a wall with in your professional life. And so that's the sweet spot of where I'm at today.
Excellent. And if you could be your coach, Lance's coach from 2013, and you can go back and redo it all over again of when you were in that role, what advice would you be giving to advisors? How different would things be? And let's take the compliance corporate shield off of you because you don't have that anymore. What real words of wisdom or advice could you give those advisors?
Yeah, you've got two back-to-back really good questions. It all starts with the client, right? The reality is, what a client so desperately wants, in my opinion, is to have you, the advisor, Evan, and all the listeners, be working with them one-on-one, free of restriction, free of compliance, to say, "Hey, here's what I think you need. Here's how I can help you. And I'm gonna do whatever I can to help you, help solve your problem or heal your ailment." And so when I think back to that period of time, I think advisors still today, but certainly then too, had an opportunity to simplify their message. Simplify their message. We as an industry, then and still today, I think overly complicate our message, our products, our solutions, our technology, as clients really want to know what they need to do, and are they okay, and will they be okay? And so when I think we start to think about investments, having a simple portfolio that meets the client's needs, applying a simple, as you've heard, one-page financial plan that's very digestible for the client to get an idea of where they're at and where they're going, making sure that they're properly insured, both for life, disability, and maybe long-term care, and then having your estate planning documents in place. And I think if you can answer those core questions for clients and get rid of all the noise and the complexity of what us as a business are trying to do behind the scenes, I think advisors could have created so much more scale with their clients and attracting new clients.
If you were in charge of creating a model for advisors to use for clients, because me and you talked a little off record of what you do for yourself, what would that model look like? How would you create it? What due diligence steps would you put into it if you needed to, or if you believe in doing that? And what process would go into those models?
Yeah, great question. I mean, if you're saying models, are you specifically referring to investments or really just?
Investments, yeah. You were talking specifically about how you invest your money. You ran an AMS division for years, advising everybody that, hey, we have all this great stuff for you. Use some of this stuff. You don't necessarily agree that it should be that complicated, right? It should be a lot simpler for most advisors that don't have teams or people behind them. Explain that.
Yeah, I'll use an example. I mean, one of the parts of my role was to meet with asset managers on a regular basis. So let's take a large cap growth manager, and let's say there are 100 large cap growth manager options. Each of those large cap growth managers would come in and present to my team. And they would go through, here's what's different about our people, our process, our philosophy, our price, our performance. And each of those 100 large cap growth managers would suggest that they've got the magic formula to pick large cap growth stocks.
Sure.
To capture more of the return, the upside, or they were specifically positioned to capture less of the return, right? Less of the downside. And so they were intentionally maybe not going to capture as much of the upside. More dividend yield, the same dividend yield, less dividend yield, that type of concept. And so the question becomes, well, I mean, how are you as the advisor or a client supposed to differentiate, between one versus the other? And that becomes really tough for the advisor to do on their own, while they're also trying to get new clients, maintain clients, do financial planning, make sure clients are properly insured. And so I continue to be a big believer that if you as an advisor do not have a dedicated money management division on your team, then you should be outsourcing that to your firm, your think tank, or outsourcing that to another firm, another dedicated CIO, so that you as the advisor can focus on the business development, on maintaining relationships, on planning. In the same way we just kicked off college football season. You've got a head coach, and then you've got all these specialists, right? The offensive coordinator, the defensive coordinator, and so on and so forth. You want to oversee the relationship without getting into the weeds, thinking that you're also the money manager, unless you've got a dedicated team that can specifically do that.
And we were talking about, even for like yourself, there's 4 or 5 funds that you believe in. You kind of dollar cost average into that, and you keep your emotions out of it. You consistently just invest that way. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to a statement I made earlier. We are expertly positioned to help our past self. So if I could go back and talk to a high school student or a college student, which I do spend time speaking into the youth space, I've got several high schools I'm going to be speaking to in the coming months. I would say, hey, listen, if you do nothing else, if you do nothing else, do what I've done, which I've simply dollar cost averaged into 4 mutual funds every 2 weeks, systematically, without emotion, for over 20 years. And you combine that with a 30-year term insurance policy, the right disability insurance coverage, and the proper estate planning documents, I could say all that and do all that in 60 seconds. And so at the very least, at the core, the majority of Americans out there should at least be checking those boxes. And if you want to make it more complex than that, cool. It just doesn't need to be more complex than that for most people's situations, in my opinion.
Excellent. It's always good to hear from somebody that job it is per se to sell a lot of things.
Yeah,
Lance,
and I'll add, like I said, there are some nuances, right? So if you need a tax-free income, or you have a sizable taxable brokerage account, and you want to buy individual securities like you and I were talking about earlier, and you want to keep your expense ratio down because you're not outsourcing that to a money manager. And oh, by the way, you've got a good software to harvest gains and losses throughout the year for, as you and I know, what's called tax alpha. And so there are some unique strategies out there that are different, that are applicable for certain client situations, that I also do believe in. But I think it's like being scared of the world's disease and illness, but yet you're a smoker, you're a heavy drinker, you're in the fast food line every single day. If you can't master the core of being healthy, then you shouldn't be worried about all the disease and illness out in the world. That's what we do within the investment space.
sure. So with this new role, you're doing motivational speaking, but you also mentioned to me that there is some individual coaching concepts that you want to start bringing out. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, as I do motivational speaking, I often have a lot of conversations with people one-on-one after that will come up to me and discuss with me how parts of my message resonated with them. And there's a common theme that sort of plays out. Many people, whether you're young, old, somewhere in the middle, professionals, they struggle with a lot of key areas of life. Number one, like we're talking about, is their wealth. And so providing just general wealth coaching, right, education and guidance is a big one without making securities recommendations. Number two is their health. What are you eating and drinking all day? Are you going to the gym or not? What does it matter if you accumulate 10 million, 20 million bucks if ultimately you retire and the next day you have a heart attack, or you've got no relationship with your kids because you're unhealthy and you die early? And then number three is yourself, right? This is sort of a catch-all: self-development, self-improvement. And this means a lot of different things to different people. You know, sometimes people are struggling in their marriages or being a parent. Sometimes they're in a transition in their career where they're saying, hey, I've achieved lots of success in my career, but now what? What's my purpose? I talked to a group of 120 men yesterday, and one of the things that I brought up was this word legacy. And we throw this word legacy around quite a bit. And all it really means is the lasting impression that you can have on others once you're gone. So the question becomes, what do you want your legacy to be? And who are the most important people in your life that it matters to? And so if you think about your legacy, is there any misalignment with how you're carrying out your life today to where you want your legacy to be and who it matters most to? And so you start to back into that and you start to do coaching and put together a plan for people. And what people really want and need is they want someone that's coming alongside of them. They want an encourager, they want a motivator, and they want an accountability partner to help them get to their goals a lot quicker than they otherwise could on their own.
Excellent. And now you have the time to actually do this stuff.
That's right. That's right.
Which is great. By the way, if you're not following Lance on LinkedIn, please look him up. He shares a lot of content, and some of his content is very deep and personal to him, but sometimes sharing that can bring out other people's thoughts and emotions when it comes to their specific situation. And I think that's a huge plus. So Lance, if anybody wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Yeah, I'll make a quick comment on what you just said, if you don't mind, Evan.
Yeah.
I find that the more real you're able to be, the more raw, the more vulnerable, the more authentic. Guess what? That's exactly what the other person wants, because then they're more real, raw, vulnerable, and authentic. And so I'd ask your listeners to keep that in mind. What we so desperately want is we want others to be real, vulnerable, and authentic. And I'm not sure when this is going to go live, but September, this month, when we're recording this, is Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. And I lost my mom to suicide 4 days before my first birthday. And I even attempted suicide myself in 8th grade. And I'm thankful to God that I was unsuccessful. But one of the biggest ways that we can combat suicide is community and talking about our struggles, that we don't have it all together despite our successes. And when you think about the fact that there will be 132 suicides per day, almost 50,000 per year in the US, and that 80% of those are men, just like you and I, Evan. And so the ability to just create awareness, stay in good health, good mental being is certainly a place to combat that. You can look me up on LinkedIn, like you said, Evan. You can find my website, Lance Cibik, CIB as in boy, IK.com. And then you can also reach me at info@lancecibik.com.
Excellent, Lance. By the way, statistically speaking, just more interested as you made that comment, I'm guessing those numbers have risen pretty dramatically over the last 50 years. Statistically speaking, have you seen those numbers increase substantially? And if you have, what do you think the reason for that increase is?
Yeah, I don't have the exact percentages, but they certainly have increased. And I think it's all the usual suspects that you would imagine. Certainly during COVID and post-COVID, there continues to be a rise in loneliness and anxiety and depression and the never-ending comparison trap in social media. All of that combined, along with certain addictions with drug and alcohol abuse goes hand in hand, side by side with the
And
rise of suicide.
with what happened with your mom, and then obviously with what happened to you, obviously you don't remember what happened to your mom until you were told what happened to your mom. But in 8th grade, you went through a very difficult situation where you considered potentially or trying to actually do that. Was there any signs? Was there anything like if you were the parent of you back then, you might have done differently to maybe that would never have occurred?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the good thing about today is there is more awareness just around mental health. There's more acceptance of it as a disease or an ailment in the same way you can see something physically that's taking place with somebody, whether that's cancer, whether it's, oh, you have COVID, Evan, or whatever it is. Mental health is something that had a stigma for a lot of years. And if you think back to when I was growing up as a child, or you think back to when my mom ultimately gave birth to me and committed suicide 4 days before my first birthday, there wasn't as much awareness. It wasn't talked about in social media. There weren't campaigns. There weren't programs and people coming in and speaking to the youth or even adults, like people like you and I, that were speaking on podcasts like we are now, or at conferences or employer events.
Sure.
So I say, if I'm a parent, which I am, to 2 young daughters, and to the listeners, I think it's just making sure that you're being diligent in what your kids are going through. Don't make assumptions that they're okay, or that whatever issues are being addressed with their friends or the school's taking care of it. Be active in their lives and be intentional about asking them how they're doing. And then ultimately, if you feel like there's a issue or concern, guiding them to resources other than yourself is certainly a good step in prevention.
Excellent point. Excellent point. I think we'll end on that, Lance. Thanks again. Great seeing you, first of all, and hearing where you're headed. I love all the ideas. And like I said, I've been a big fan since you've left, because now you can actually say what's on your mind, which is actually probably a very liberating experience anyway, being outside that corporate shield. And we're looking forward to seeing phenomenal things from you, Lance, in the future. So thanks again for joining.
Right back at you. I've enjoyed the podcast as a listener, and now having the opportunity to be a guest. So thanks for having me on, Evan.
Excellent. For those of you out there, hopefully you enjoyed today's podcast. Please follow Lance on LinkedIn. Look him up. He is a phenomenal guy. He's got phenomenal messages, and we all look forward to seeing where he goes in the future. Thanks again, and have a great day.